All right, Jesse, I think we're pretty good to kick things off.
Great. Well, Sam, I appreciate you pulling this together. And to everyone on the phone, I know we had about 75 folks that were interested in this topic, and we continued to hear it from our clients. And so we figured we'd formalize things a little bit today and bring this to organizations that have an interest in leveraging Intune in their existing environment or just want to learn more about it. And so I wanted to introduce to you guys today a personal friend and colleague, Steve Rattacasa, who will be leading our conversation. A little bit about Steve, and for those of you that haven't had an opportunity to meet him, Steve is a teacher and technologist and has really provided a tremendous amount of value to our clients, not only on the Intune space, but in multiple areas surrounding the cloud and mobility areas within our customers today. And so we've asked Steve to put together what we feel like is an action-packed overview of this product that many of you already have entitlement to. And so when we look to help our clients achieve more with less and really simplify their security posture, this is a big part of that. And we have multiple deployments going on with several customers today. And so we really, again, are just trying to emphasize the value that can be brought through this technology. So Steve, I'm sure you've had at least 3 cups of coffee and you're ready to get us kicked off. For those of you that don't know, Steve is an avid coffee roaster as well and does a nice job with that. But without further ado, Steve, I'll turn it over to you. And we will have Q&A coming into the panel. Again, we have lots of people on the WebEx this morning. So please use the chat if you do have questions, and we will answer those and queue those up, and then we'll leave a few minutes at the end to answer any conversation or questions that you guys have. So Steve, I'll hand it to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, and any questions, Jesse, as we go along, if it feels appropriate for the context of where we are in the content, feel free to pause me and we can knock those down as we go through. We do have a lot of content today, so just know in advance I'll be moving fairly quickly. The Intune product can do a lot of things and has a lot of kind of bells and whistles, but we're going to break it down to where we feel customers tend to use it the most, and we'll walk through those. So for the agenda today, and I promise it'll be brief on the first 2 items of kind of identifying what it is and what it's not, as well as the licensing methods in which you might already own it, and if not, how you can gain access to it. Like I mentioned, we'll go through the common scenarios where we see customers evaluating Intune as the solution of choice, and then how it actually addresses those different scenarios, and then what that kind of workflow and process looks like. So to start, Intune is a cloud-based service for unified endpoint management. And that means that it can manage mobile devices, Android and iOS. It can also manage Windows devices and Mac OS devices. A lot of times people think Intune is mobile device only. And that's because one of the most common use cases is for kind of a BYOD type of enablement, where we're allowing users to bring in an iPhone or tablets into the environment that the user themselves own. But it can do much more than that. And so the new kind of technology buzz phrase is unified endpoint management, and that is what Intune will be. It is a point of validation for accessing corporate data. So Intune is a kind of gateway into a lot of the Office 365 type of stack, where it can ensure that a device is compliant with the policies that you set, and then it can validate if those things change. It'll mark devices not compliant, and that gives us some things that we can do based on that. It is also a major component of Microsoft's modern management approach. Modern management is another one of those phrases that has a million different definitions in the tech space today. You'll see a lot of marketing around modern management, but essentially what it is the ability to manage devices flexibly that provides the user with the consumer type experience that they've become accustomed to, but also allows the IT side to manage things in accordance to the compliance and requirements that the business has for them. What it is not an on-premise deployment. And by that, I mean there's not a physical box that's going to show up that you need to rack and stack cable up in the data center. There's no virtual machines or virtual appliances that get deployed for it. It is a truly cloud-based service. It is not, again, mobile device only. It does a lot above and beyond, as we'll see here today. Unlike the way Jesse White spells it, the T in Intune is not capitalized. And it is not rocket surgery. And in that, I mean, it's quite a simple product. It is extremely powerful, but because there's a lot of it driven through policies. It's very straightforward to actually implement, and it's straightforward to administer. It solves a variety of problems, and some of those you'll see here. The first and foremost is the awareness of the devices that have access to your data today. So one of the things that tends to be a pretty common scenario is if you were to ask an IT admin, what devices have company email on them today, they really don't know, because we've become accustomed to, on my personal device, I can log in to my email, and the IT department really doesn't have any visibility into that device. We've seen instances where somebody on an iPad might use their iPad or tablet, for a couple weeks, and then log into email, use it when they need to on vacation, and then they give that away, and they give that to a nephew, a cousin, and that still has access to the company data, and it still has company data on it. But again, the IT department doesn't know about that device, and Intune helps address those scenarios. It also helps with reducing drastically the time sink of device provisioning. So this is not only the mobile devices, but this comes in tremendously valuable for Windows 10 devices, and we're going to go into that a fair amount later. It is it's very capable of delivering security policies and configurations, and then verifying that those things are maintained. So it doesn't just push it out once and then never touch it or evaluate it again. It can push down the policies that you've configured, allowing you to secure those devices. But then also, if things change on that device, it'll be able to either push them back down so that it stays compliant or mark it as not compliant. You can use it to deliver applications, mobile platform, and then again to Windows 10. This is a huge value add, as a lot of the times in the past we needed tools to be able to do this, built either third-party tools or additional kind of enterprise level tools for this. In the scenario I mentioned before, where if there is an iPad that has data on it, and that was stolen, lost, or given away, we can eliminate that data. We can wipe that data from the device, and that allows us to have that level of protection and reduce the potential for data leakage. And then it also does BYOD enablement and readiness, which leads into the next slide here, which is the common scenarios that we see customers bringing Intune into the conversation for. Bring your own device is probably the number one. I think that's true not only of our customers, but also of the market in general. And this is one of the reasons I think people believe Intune is mobile device only, which again, we'll see why it's not quite limited that way. Bring your own device initiatives have a ton of value to businesses and organizations. We won't dive into all those. You've probably become familiar with those over time. But this allows you to protect the device, but allow the user to use their preferred device, either for mobile or, again, it can be in a Windows environment. It allows for modern management, which is the second reason we see customers evaluating it. Zero-touch deployments, we're going to go into in a fair amount of depth here in a bit. But this is essentially the ability to provision a device for a user without having IT involved. And this is a super, super time saver, and it's a tremendous piece in that modern management stack that Microsoft has kind of built out. We see people evaluating it for security reasons. They want that visibility to the endpoint. They want to be able to protect the data. They're a little bit concerned with legacy authentication, and they want to be able to not only lock that down, but then also deliver applications that use modern authentication technologies for additional security. And then the fourth one that Jesse mentioned there, you see a lot of environments that already have entitlement to this. So they realize that, hey, I actually have the ability to use this. I'm just not sure how I can use it. And that happens more often than you'd think. Now, if there is a specific reason other than those scenarios that you are watching, we would love to hear it, and we want to make sure that we do our best to address it. So if you can go ahead and leave that in the chat or send in a message here on the webinar, we'll do our best. I do have the ability to demo some things and to show the interface. So if it comes down to it and it's something completely external to what we covered today, let us know, and we'll do our best to make sure we address that for you. So here are the licenses that Intune is included into today. These are the ways in which you might already own it. So I wanted to make sure we covered that on the front end. So if you are familiar with what your licensing levels are in the Microsoft world, you can look at this list here. And if not, you can start to dig through that. And we're always happy to help if you're unsure what your license level is. It is available as a standalone product, but we generally would recommend at the very least evaluating the underlined license level there, the Enterprise Mobility Suite E3, or EMS E3 as it's commonly abbreviated. This gives you access to some Azure Premium features that work tremendously well hand in hand with Intune. But you do have that option available if you wanted to go standalone. We just want to make sure you understand what your license level is today in case there are some of those features and tie-ins that you'd like to leverage. So moving into that first scenario of bring your own device for mobile devices, this graphic does a great job of kind of helping to visualize what this looks like in practice. So you'll see here there is a kind of corporate bubble on the device. Now this is a device that is not owned by the organization. So this is a user's device. But in order to manage it, we can provision this secured area on the device to distribute applications and policies. And then if that user leaves for any reason, we can pull that corporate bubble off their device without impacting the personal applications and the personal data that they have on it. This helps to address this kind of age-old balance of security with usability and security, where we want to restrict things, but at the same time, we want to make sure that it's actually usable. And we see this all the time. Employees want fast, easy access. They want to be able to work from anywhere on any internet connection. They don't want to have to be tied to the physical office or the walls of the company. They want to be able to collaborate. They want to be able to use the devices that they love to use. And IT on the flip side of that has to be able to protect the data and secure access to that data and to make sure that the only people that can access the data is the people that should access that data. And then there's the need to stay innovative. We used to joke that if you are a new employee at a company, you kind of always were handed down the tank pad, which was like a 19-pound laptop that had been used by 18 employees before you got there. And when you have those types of situations where you're using devices that you hate, it's not good for anybody. It's not good for you. It's not good for the productivity of your function in the organization. And that's ultimately not good for the organization itself. It limits some of the hiring opportunities, and it makes it a little bit of a challenge for employee retention. So when it comes to using Intune to address the bring your own device scenario, there's kind of a standard life cycle that all devices would go through in the Intune world, where the first one is enrollment. And that essentially just means bringing the device into the Intune system so that Intune is now aware of it. This is going to be different depending on the type of device and the level of ownership. So in the scenario we're discussing, it's going to be more of a bring your own device. But if corporate is going to be purchasing and provisioning devices for users, that enrollment process would look slightly differently. And we'll touch on that here in a minute. After the devices are enrolled, you'll have the ability to provision policies, to push down applications and restrictions onto those things so that you can layer in the level of security that's needed, the applications that the user needs to do their job, and then you shift that over into kind of ongoing management and protection. The last step of retirement is if the employee leaves or if their device is lost or stolen or needs to be provisioned for somebody else, you can selectively wipe either applications or data, or if it's a corporate-owned device, you can wipe the entire device itself, and then you can re-enroll it with the next employee or whoever that device ends up going to. Now, I know this slide has a lot of information, so I'm going to leave it up here for a minute. What you would need to know and what that enrollment process actually looks like, in a bring your own device scenario, it's very simple. The user downloads an application called the Microsoft Company Portal, and they use their credentials to authenticate into it. Once they do that, hopefully there's a second factor or multi-factor authentication enabled. Once they do that, it'll enroll itself into Intune, and you now have access to help manage that device. Very, very straightforward. For fully managed devices, these are generally going to be devices that the corporation owns. There's going to be a variety of different methods that we can use. The best one is a zero-touch deployment. This requires a partner, and in the US, Verizon is a really good example, where you would go to Verizon to procure your phones as you would normally do, except you would tell them, hey, we use Intune for mobile device management. And then they'll actually connect into your Intune environment and push device information across. So if you provision a new phone, it automatically appears in Intune. You can associate a policy to it, and then the device can go directly to the user. When the user turns it on, they walk through the normal setup. And as part of that setup, it automatically enrolls into Intune, and IT did not need to be involved in that process. Again, that's going to be corporate-owned devices. For bring your own device, it's simply install an app and enter your credentials. Now, these are screenshots from that process on an Android device. And you'll see here the application gets downloaded. It walks you through. These are the steps that you'll have to step through. We care about your privacy, so here are the things that Intune can never see, and here are some of the things that they can see. Once you accept the terms and conditions, it goes through to set up a work profile, and then you kind of step through the wizard. I'll leave this up here for a second. That aka.ms link is their walkthrough content for Android, and I wanted to call this out because Microsoft has done a very good job on the documentation of this, not only for the admins who will be using the system, but also for the users and how they can walk through an enrollment. So if they're confused or they get lost in that process, which does happen, that they can go and they can find step-by-step information. So as they go through, they activate the work profile on their device. At this point, Intune will say, here are some requirements that the company has. If you want to enroll into Intune, for example, we need a certain level of password. We want to make sure that when you lock your phone, that there's a password required to unlock it. You'll see here in this middle screenshot, this is the password here is too short. So maybe it's two characters or 4 characters and it needs to be 6. It'll prompt the user to resolve that. Once it's resolved, they can click continue, and then they're all set. This is an example of what one of those compliance policies look like. Again, this is where it's evaluating bringing the device into Intune and marking the device as compliant or not. So you'll see here we're requiring a password. We can block simple passwords if we'd like. We can set the minimum length. Very, very basic settings here. And then you'll see here on the bottom, my phone is compliant. And this interface that you're seeing right here is standard across the board for Intune. So when I mentioned earlier, it's quite simple to actually manage. There are a lot of features and a lot of things that you can configure, but they're all going to look like this. There's going to be a configure or don't configure. There's going to be a couple of parameters that you can set. It's very straightforward. Now, once a device is enrolled, we'll start looking at provisioning things for the device. So the first one here, you'll have configuration policies for the device. Now, this is one of those things that's kind of weird to explain because you're going to hear me say policies or configuration policies like 50 times in the next 2 minutes. Just know that this right now is a device configuration policy. So the physical device itself gets a policy that we can provision to it. I've included a screenshot here so you can see what some of this looks like. On the physical device, we can enable or disable the camera. This is a good way to think about it. It's a physical thing on the device itself. One of the other features we can do, we can also push down Wi-Fi settings, which is super helpful for many users, especially if you're using anything that might require certificates. These are things that, again, fall into that provision bucket. Now, this is an application configuration policy. So before we were configuring a device, now we're going to configure an application on the device. So here in this case, let's say we've pushed down Microsoft Outlook or Outlook Mobile. We really don't want users to be typing in server information. We don't want them setting authentication types. So we can go ahead and do that all for them. You can see here, I'll call this out, modern authentication. This is where we want to be, not just for Intune, but across the board in your organization. We're going to hammer on legacy authentication a bit later, but this is where you want to be wherever possible. And again, this is an application configuration policy. Next is application protection policies. So this is going to be a little bit more specific to the data within the application itself. And you'll see here on the data protection tab, we can say, don't allow the data from this application to be backed up because we don't want users maybe to back up company data that we no longer have visibility into. And we only want to allow organizational data to pass in the applications that we manage. So for example, if we push down Microsoft Outlook and Microsoft Word, we're okay if an attachment opens in Microsoft Word. But what we don't want to do is to allow copy and pasting where somebody can highlight an entire email and then paste it somewhere else on their phone. And these are the types of policies that let you protect against that. Another setting here, and I find this super cool. I'm a nerd, unapologetically a nerd, and I use this on my phone where when I launch Outlook, it requires a PIN. And this is not the same PIN that you use to log into your phone. So if you have certain applications that might require that extra step or that extra level, or if you just want to be nerd cool like me, this is a great way that you can do that. I will tell you that from a user standpoint, you want to allow them to use their fingerprint because otherwise they're going to get frustrated in having a PIN for their phone and then a PIN for their app. I think it's cool. Some people do, some people don't, but I always like to include it because it is an extra option that is available. And then it is worth noting that if you do set that PIN, any app that you have in that work context on the device will share that PIN. So we've seen configuring a device with a policy, we've seen configuring the application, we've seen protecting the data in the application. Now there's the ability to provision the app, to actually deploy the app if we want, or to just make the app available and allow the user to choose if they want to install it. This is a screenshot from what it looks like within the Intune portal for an Android device. So here it'll actually reach out to the Google Play Store. You can say, this is the app that I want. You'll notice, and I'll call out here, that the application offers a managed config. So this means that it has some Intune hooks that let us configure it. And the options you'll have once you do it, or once you approve the app, is you can either require it to install, which means it will push it to the user's device. You can make it available. So when they look at the company portal app, they'll see it as an available application, but it doesn't push it down. It's up to them if they'd like to install it. And then there's an uninstall feature if you need to pull an application off of devices for any reason. And again, this app offers managed configuration. If there's a specific app you have for your business or in mind, ask and we can take a look and see if it is marked this way. But Google does a great job of identifying what those applications are.
Hey, Steve, a couple questions coming in the chat, and I just figured that would be a good place to pause. So some of our participants have asked, is this a direct replacement for SCCM in this software deployment perspective?
So that is a loaded question. The answer is it can be. Microsoft has, as of maybe October of last year, they announced what they called co-management licensing. So if you have SCCM today, here's some good news. You have entitlement to Intune for the Windows devices that you're managing with it today. Zero cost, that is available to you right now. Now, where you want to do the application deployment is up to you. Once Intune and SCCM talk to each other, you are now in what they call a co-management state, and the two kind of enhance the functionality of one another. They do have some overlap, but they're now configured such that one will recognize when the other is doing something so that they don't conflict. So to answer the question of, is it going to replace SCCM for application deployment? It doesn't have to. And we've seen a lot of customers continue to use SCCM, but to leverage Intune for some of the other things that we'll see here in a bit. But if you decided that, hey, SCCM is just a little bit too complex, we'd really like to move the workloads away from it if we can, you do have that capability with Intune.
Okay, thank you.
So what we've seen so far is the enrollment and the provisioning, right? Bringing the device into Intune, laying down either applications or policies or all of the above. Here we'd move into the ongoing management and protection of those devices. Again, this is going to be, we've got these settings applied to it. Let's make sure that they stay that way. And then the retirement of a device would look like either wiping some of the data, wiping the entire device if it's a corporate device, or in the case of a device being lost or stolen, that we can pull the data down and eliminate it from being at risk. And that's kind of what that life cycle looks like. Now for the next scenario, and again, this was for kind of a bring your own device. We used a lot of the examples there. That's kind of that number one scenario we see people evaluating this solution for. The next one is modern management. And this is definitely a marketing slide, so I'll be super brief here. But the way that traditional IT worked, a user had one device, it was owned by the company, it sat at a desk, it stayed on the company network. And if they had problems, a desktop engineer or desktop technician would walk over to them. That's what it used to look like. That is definitely not what it looks like today. Instead of one device, it's many devices. Some of them are owned by the company, some of them are not. The applications aren't all corporate applications. Some are SaaS, some are in the cloud. And we want to have as much of an automated handling of those situations as possible. And so if you looked, SCCM was kind of a traditional approach, something like SUS for handling updates. You were on the corporate network. You had a custom corporate image where you would have all of your device drivers, regardless of what type of device it was. There was a lot that went into managing in that method. Now, the more modern approach for things like updates is Update for Business. You can do it on any internet connection. You've got Microsoft Store for Business, which is Microsoft's kind of app store that you can configure for your environment. You have an OEM image that's optimized for a Windows 10 on the physical piece of hardware. It's a different approach entirely. And as I mentioned at the start, Intune is helping it to take a giant step in that modern management direction. Now, this next slide is one of my favorite slides that I've ever seen. And this is the path to help get to modern management. Now, I will call your attention to the big switch transition because this is just such a great graphic. We don't generally recommend that you load up everything into the bus and you take your shot for the desired island. But if you're willing to give it a shot, I am too. So you just let us know. Most organizations aren't going to fall into the first two, the cloud first. That's generally going to be a new company that's starting out and they want to have everything modern to begin with. Those are kind of the ideal. The big switch is where you just say, hey, listen, we want to cut over tomorrow at noon and let's do this. It's a little bit for the adventurers at heart, but not really going to be the most effective method. It's usually going to be a group by group transition where we can go either departmentally or based on specific technologies that we'd kind of want to embrace. And then the co-management I mentioned before is a specific term used by Microsoft now for SCCM and Intune kind of combined. And this tends to work a little bit better. Let's do a group and a technology. We'll move one thing kind of over at a time. This is now considered a destination. In the past, Microsoft said co-management was kind of a stepping stone. Now having that is considered the end state. So if you can get to that point where you're moving workloads over, Microsoft thinks you're way above and beyond most other organizations. Now, the traditional deployments from yesteryear looked a lot like this. You would get a device, you would wipe it entirely. So it would come with Windows from whoever your partner was. You would wipe it, and then you would load in your specific image that has every driver for every possible device that that physical piece of hardware could be. And you'd lay in some policies, you would push down some applications. And it was just really time consuming. It was very costly. The new way of doing it looks a lot like this. You have an OEM optimized version of Windows 10. You're going to add on your software and your settings. You're going to push down the updates and feature updates. And if you're using OneDrive, you can also layer in the user data. Now, if you're using things like Box or ShareFile or any of these other types of things, you can do the same type of stuff there. And then the device is ready to use. Now, imagine this scenario without requiring the involvement of IT. And that is what Windows Autopilot is. So Windows Autopilot allows you to partner with certain OEM vendors, Dell, Lenovo, a couple others like that. You let that vendor know that you are using Microsoft Intune. When you provision a new device or you purchase a new device, they will push over a device ID into your Intune cloud, and then you can ship the device directly to the employee. No touching, no interaction from IT beyond configuring that profile one time. When the user gets that device, they're going to unbox it, turn it on, and it will deploy. It'll go through it'll push down all your policies, it'll push down the applications that are required, and it automatically registers it into Intune. Or excuse me, enrolls it into Intune. And this is going to be a quick video, and I'll talk through it as it goes. This was recorded on a Hyper-V VM because it's easier to record, but this is what the user essentially would see. They would get the device, they would turn it on, it would say, hey, connect us to a network. It would go through. You can use a wireless network for this, which is worth pointing out. It'll go through a couple of resets, and then it'll get to a state where they'll actually enter in their credentials. So their username, password. Again, hopefully we're already using multi-factor authentication, and if not, please reach out to us because we would love to get you on that path. But once they log in, they'll go through the standard setup, and you'll see here this is going to be logging in or a prompt for multi-factor authentication, which means that this user probably had something, ping on their phone. They'll approve that, and then it'll go through what looks like a normal step, and you'll see here what the difference looks like. And this device setup is the key here. So you'll see it's going to say, here are the security policies we're pushing down, here are the certificates we're going to install, and these are the apps that we're going to install as well. Once it's done, the user is now ready to work. And so looking at this in a little bit more detail, again, you have a hardware vendor that pushes their device IDs, and this is going to be like a hash device ID to you, and it automatically populates into the cloud, essentially, the autopilot service. They ship the device directly to an employee, and the employee unboxes, turns it on, and they're good to go. But you can also use this for existing devices, where you can pull down the hardware IDs, and you can import them. And then from now on, if you needed to re-provision those devices, you can push it through this autopilot process. Now, there are a lot of ways that this can get used. These are the 4 that Microsoft have identified. The first one I went through is kind of the user-driven mode, where a user turns it on, they enter in their credentials, they step through the wizard, and they're good to go. The self-deploying is for kiosks, so we don't see this too often, but if you did have a kiosk use case, you can automatically have it provision itself. The autopilot reset is if you were to factory reset a device that you already have, you can then run it through the autopilot process so that you're no longer having to just delete it, layer in your own image. You can basically bring it back to factory, and then it'll go through that similar wizard to what we just saw. And then as an extra feature, and Microsoft jokes about this white glove option, they didn't think they were going to need it. And it's very similar to what you just saw, except instead of the user doing the setup of the device, it's IT. Microsoft joked that, well, listen, we didn't think we were going to need this. We thought bypassing IT and just sending the device to the user and making them have kind of a consumer experience was going to be great. But it turns out that there are some users that don't like that. There are some users that don't have patience, and there are some users that are, quote, special users. And so for these special users, they introduced this white glove option where you can bring the device into IT, the way you have in the past, connect it to a network, turn it on, and you go through that wizard. Instead of the user waiting, it's the IT team's time waiting, because, time in IT is just wasted, right? So we can just burn those hours as necessary. But you turn it on, you walk through the wizard like you just did, and then you reseal the device, and then you ship it to the user. The white glove is just kind of a little bit of a bump in the wire, so to speak, of IT sets up the device and then ships it over to the user. Now, there are some requirements for this. It needs to be Windows 10 Pro Plus, because there are some domain functionalities that you do not get with things like Windows Home. You do need the Azure Premium 1 license or better. And I mentioned at the very, very beginning, we recommend things like EMS E3, and this is one of those reasons. You would need Intune or an alternative MDM solution. And then there are going to be some network requirements, but generally it's going to be, as long as you can get out to the internet and you're not restricting any outbound flow, that's usually okay. Now, keep in mind that from a user perspective, if the user is receiving the device at home, so let's walk through this bizarre scenario that we're currently finding ourselves in. If you have users that are working remotely because of the COVID-19 situation, and you want to get them a device, but you can't really ship it to IT because nobody's in the building, excuse me. So you would ship the device to the user themselves, and then it would use their internet connection to pull down your policies, all encrypted via the cloud, and you'd be able to get them a new device, fully provisioned at their home, instead of having to ship it to IT. Now, this is the list of participating manufacturers today. This list does change and gets updated, but I think we've seen most of the time this covers the vast majority of our customer base. And again, these are the partners that are going to be able to integrate into the Intune portion. Now, if you don't have one of these partners, but you still want to use Intune, you can. It's just a lot more tedious because you'll have to ingest those device IDs yourselves, as opposed to allowing these partners to push that information across for you. Now, this modern management and the manageability of the future, we've covered a bunch of things already today. We covered managing mobile devices and protecting access to certain things within that, and layering policies that have certain compliance requirements. Now we're starting to look a little bit more on the security side and what this looks like. So we'll dive into what conditional access means and how you can leverage it. It is a tremendously valuable technology that is included as part of that EMS E3 suite. And we'll, again, dive into that here in a minute. But we can restrict certain access to things. So if we've got Exchange Online, you might not want everyone to be able to get to that without knowing about the device first. But then it becomes a bit of a nightmare, because how do we know about the device? And can we enroll these devices in enough frequency, and preferably as a large group? And that's what the enrollment with bulk methods like the autopilot allows you to do. Moving into that security world, this was a stat from Microsoft. In their environment, 730,000 accounts were compromised in the cloud due to password spray attacks. And if you're not familiar with password spray attacks, they're like an intelligently modified brute force, where in the past you would just hammer on one account over and over and over and over until you got the right password. And then very simple lockout policies would prevent that from working. But what the attackers now do is they say, here's a list of passwords and here's a list of accounts. We're going to go one account and try it, next account, try it, next account. And they do this over and over. So it avoids being locked out. It allows them to use kind of the same style of almost brute forcing that they have in the past. And it is a huge percentage of compromised accounts that we see today. And the method that they're able to do this on is anything leveraging legacy authentication. This is I think it's over 99%, as you'll see in the next slide, of these types of attacks occur against legacy authentication technologies. Users have no idea if they're using legacy technology. Most of the identity and access management systems can't see which clients are using it. And if you were to just try to cut this off at the knees, you would have outages that would be very impactful. And for this reason, not all legacy is a good legacy. And they are the #1 attack vector for those types of attacks. There are no multi-factor authentication methods if you're using legacy authentication. This is part of the reason that we're pushing very hard for modern authentication that lets us use multiple factors. 40% of the compromised accounts through these authentication methods, through legacy authentication methods. And in January alone, it was almost 500,000 of accounts compromised through this. If that doesn't scare you on the security side, Microsoft has put out a statement that says, hey, after October, we're not allowing these basic authentications for Exchange. So if you have users today that are using legacy authentication methods, and I'll show you some examples here in a minute, after October, you're going to have to find a solution to this anyway. This is a clock that or a stopwatch that has already been started. And now two-thirds reduction in compromises if you disable legacy authentication. 67% reduction by eliminating that today. Here are some examples of what that looks like. I've highlighted a couple in red that I think we've seen the most. Things like Auto Discover and MAPI over HTTP. Outlook Anywhere was very, very common, and it was used quite recently, Outlook 2016. And again, I'll actually leave this up here for a second. This is the method in which attacks are occurring. Password spray attacks compromise 40% or make up 40% of the compromised accounts, and over 99% of password spray attacks occur via legacy authentication. So this is a very large kind of security risk today. This is a large attack vector. Now, Intune can address this a couple different ways. The first one is that you can use conditional access in report-only mode, and we're going to step through what that looks like here in a second. But basically, you can say, I'd like to report and see what's coming into the environment using legacy authentication. I don't want to turn it off because I don't want to induce an outage, but I have no idea what systems are using it. Report only allows you to log that information and then build out those plans. So you can say, okay, well, we didn't realize these systems were still using it. Let's start to plan out what that looks like to either update the system or migrate the system or adjust the way that it's functioning today. And then Intune can also push down, like we saw before, it can push out Outlook, and then it can configure it to use modern authentication. So you're kind of hitting it on both sides. You're identifying what it is, where you have the ability to turn it off when you're ready, and then you're already replacing the applications that can't do it today. And again, 2/3 reduction in compromises for tenants. And this is a Microsoft stat if you disable legacy authentication today. Now, conditional access is actually an Azure Premium 1 feature. And it's quite simple to understand and to use, but it's very, very powerful. And you've probably heard it called by other names. Different vendors call it different things. Sometimes it's contextual access or situational access. But what it basically is, it's conditions. And then based on those conditions, we allow or disallow access, right? Literally in the name, conditional access. So you'll see here, we've got this cloud app selected, which is Exchange Online. And we want to select the platforms to which to apply this to, so Android, iOS, and any of the 3 people still using Windows phones. And then we're going to say, in order to access this, we require the device to be compliant, or we can say require multi-factor authentication. We can also set things like require an approved client app, and that allows you to say, hey, we want to allow access to Exchange Online via Outlook for these platforms. And then you could say all of these things must be met, or just one of them needs to be met in order to allow this access. Now, what it looks like for legacy authentication, you would configure the policy to look like this. So you'd say mobile apps and desktop clients that are marked as other clients block access. Very straightforward. Now, this is the option that allows you to say, instead of just turning it on and potentially causing an outage, you can report on these what is coming in, and you'll see them report as other clients. And this again allows you then to investigate and to identify, and to kind of plan out moving away from legacy authentication. Now, conditional access has some additional enhancements within Intune. And I mentioned way back that you can set policies that must be kind of met in order for a device to be considered compliant. And if something changes where it falls out of compliance, the device would be marked as non-compliant. So if the device gets jailbroken or the user removes their password, those types of things. Well, here with conditional access and Intune, we can say require the device to be marked as compliant. And a device that has no policy assigned to it, which are devices that we don't know about, connecting in from we don't know where, mark those by default as not compliant. So when you layer this in together, you've got a security approach that lets you say, I'd like to say, these are the devices that I know about, and these are the devices that I will allow to connect based on these policies. So I might know about this laptop, for example, but it's connecting in from somewhere I don't recognize. So we're going to go ahead back to this screenshot, excuse me here, and require multi-factor authentication. It's a compliant device, but it's connecting from somewhere we don't know about. So we're going to add that extra step, a little bit of extra security there. And then we're going to say any devices that we don't know about, we're marking them as not compliant. And so if you would like that access, here's the policies that you need to follow. And if you're an attacker trying to get in from the outside, we're going to block you at the front door. That's what it looks like on the security side. So hopefully we've gone, I think we've still got plenty of time for questions, which is great. So hopefully you understand the different scenarios that we've covered, the bring your own device and how we can manage those devices, deploy apps to them, secure them, what the modern management looks like with things like autopilot and the zero-touch deployments that are available, how we can leverage it for security to not only know about the endpoints, but to block the ones that we don't, how we can identify risks with things like legacy authentication. And then hopefully if you do have access to this application, or even if you just have access to things like conditional access, you've got a little bit of a better understanding of where you can apply those different technologies today. Now, what else can it do? It can do so many other things that I didn't want to overrun this by making the font size like 8. But you can enforce multi-factor authentication like you've seen with conditional access. You can manage Windows updates, which is a huge time saver, especially if you have people dedicated to managing things like SUS today. You can go to Update for Business, and the settings within Intune look a lot like what you're used to if you were to just look at your laptop or desktop today for what those Windows settings are. You could set those different update rings. You can integrate it with SCCM and for a true code management where you can handle some of the extra features that you get from Intune, like autopilot here, but you can still use SCCM to do some provisioning and application deployment if you need. One other thing that you can do, depending on your license level, is integrate with Microsoft's Advanced Threat Protection. And what this will do is it will determine a device's compliance based upon a classification of risk. The example Microsoft gives, which is really powerful, is if a user accidentally clicks a link, right? Never happens in any environment, but let's just say for sake of argument that a user clicked something that they maybe shouldn't have clicked. If a malware package runs, the Advanced Threat Protection identifies that as something that's anomalous and then raises the risk classification of that device. That device is immediately marked as not compliant, and any policies that you say do not allow access for non-compliant devices will prevent that from spreading on the network. Will prevent it from accessing things like Exchange Online or OneDrive or SharePoint. And that's an automatic functionality. You can also use it to encrypt Windows and Mac OS file systems with BitLocker or File Vault. If you're using passwordless authentication, which is a great technology that we don't see implemented quite as often as we'd like, you can use it to integrate with Hello for Business. You can replace group policy objects. Not all of them today, but it's like 90-something% of your GPOs. You can move that over to Intune and allow Intune to push those policies. Again, moving towards a more flexible, modern management. And then the activation lock is something we've seen hit so many of our customers where if a user has an iPhone today, corporate gave them, when they turn it in, because maybe they've left the company, you need the user's Apple ID in order to reuse that device. That's a really weird conversation. Hey, Bob, can you come back to the company? We need your credentials real quick. You're not going to ask them for their password. So you generally need them to physically be there. It's just not a good thing. And this allows you to say, for a corporate-owned device, we can go ahead and bypass that activation lock. If we need to wipe the device, we can wipe it, and we don't need to have the previous user sign back into it. So some of the key takeaways: Intune's simple but extremely powerful platform. You can manage your devices more securely. It enables things like bring your own device, and it simplifies the deployment of those devices. It's a huge step towards that path of modern management with things like zero-touch deployments. You can improve your overall security posture with things like conditional access, especially for Office 365 and your cloud-enabled applications. Please use multi-factor authentication. If you're not, please reach out to us so we can see what it would look like in your environment to get that spun up. And then you can also locate with no impact to your environment today and eventually disable those legacy authentication methods by using things like report only. This again is a clock that's already ticking. There's an October 2020 deadline for this. So it's something you certainly need to be aware of. Now, if you're convinced that Intune has some applicability in your environment and you're not sure what to do next, first and foremost, if you have a COVID-19 related user need, if you would love to be able to use it autopilot because you've got some users that are, kind of self-isolating or quarantined and you want to get them some hardware, please let us know ASAP so we can prioritize that appropriately. But from a general deployment standpoint, what this usually looks like, we would love to sit down and understand the problem that you're looking to solve and how it helps, empower or enable things within your business. There are, I think, 30-day trial licenses with Intune, so we do see a lot of proof of concepts get spun up where we can do things like test that BYOD functionality, help get you and your team maybe familiar with what it does, how it works. Once you kind of step through the enrollment and the provisioning, it kind of starts to click and make sense. And like I mentioned earlier, it's very policy driven. So it's not really a complicated thing, but it does take a few minutes to kind of get your bearings. And then once you have that, if you want to do a proof of concept with something like BYOD, push Outlook. Outlook and email is probably the number one most requested application that would love to be secured. And you could go ahead and push it and configure it so that the user launches it, takes their credentials, and off they go. And they don't need to do anything kind of above and beyond that. And then you can do things like, let's test the policy, make sure it works. If you have access to conditional access today, if you're entitled for Azure Premium 1, go ahead right now and turn on this legacy authentication and report only mode. There's a great article from Microsoft on the step-by-step on that, but we're always happy to help if you've got some questions. And then get planning because that timeline, like I mentioned, is coming quickly. If you have context-specific questions, meaning things specific to your organization, and you're kind of curious, like how what it would look like to set up a proof of concept specifically to your environment, or how Intune would layer on top of things like SCCM from the earlier question, please reach out to your Katalyst rep. And if you don't know who they are, there's the contact information on the screen. If there are any other questions, comments, complaints, and always appreciate creative insults, that's my email address there on the bottom. And Jesse, if we've got questions, I think we still got a good bit of time to go through them.
Thank you, Steve. Great job. I appreciate your preparedness as well as your efficiency this morning. I think you hit lots of the questions that we have had from clients in the past, but we do have several here in the chat that I wanted to go ahead and offer up. So the first question from the audience is, can I use Intune to join devices to my domain?
You can, yes. So there's one of the enrollment methods for Windows devices is actually an auto enrollment. And as part of that autopilot process, you can do either an Azure Active Directory join or a hybrid Active Directory join, which is the method I think most people are kind of familiar with today. So the answer to that question is yes.
Okay, great. This one is certainly hashtag COVID-19, but can I leverage Intune to deploy third-party VPN clients and profiles?
That's a great question. So it would depend on the third-party application. If it's for a mobile device or if it's available in the Microsoft Store, those are the applications that we can just immediately pull in and push down. If there's an MSI installer, there's a possibility that we can do that as well because you can push down MSI-based installations. From a configuration standpoint, I think we'd have to look a lot deeper into the specifics there. Sometimes you can do that with part of the MSI package and itself to kind of help configure that, but there's definitely some specifics we'd have to drill into to give a full-blown thumbs up on that.
Okay, great. And again, this is being recorded and we can do some follow-ups via messaging or email as appropriate. So a couple more, Steve, that we have here. My organization has lots of MacBooks or Macintosh devices in it. How can Intune help here?
Yeah. So just like with Windows, iOS, and Android, there's enrollment methods for Mac OS as well. So it would look a little bit different from an enrollment standpoint, but the functionality would be similar. Now, in terms of the policies you can configure, Microsoft will allow the most, meaning that the policies available to Microsoft for Windows 10 is going to be a huge list. For something on Android, Google is the limiter of what they can do, and obviously for Mac, it's going to be an Apple kind of restriction. But yeah, you can absolutely enroll Mac OS. It can do Windows, iOS, Android, and Mac OS. And as I pointed out in the slide, also Windows Phone, if you are one of the two or three people still using that.
That's right. I heard there's still a few of those users on the planet. All right, great. One more question here, actually a couple more. I have 200 people in my organization. How long would it take to deploy this technology?
So it depends. It depends on what devices we're looking at, honestly. If it's everybody already has their phones and their BYOD, we would need to set up some enrollment things, and then it's at the speed the users can enroll. If we wanted to start doing things like Windows 10 configurations, depending on what that Azure footprint or Azure Active Directory footprint looks like today, would determine how quickly we can move there. But once the policies are set up, the ongoing management and maintenance isn't too hard. So that usual effort is probably 1 or 2 weeks to sit down and understand the requirements and then to go through testing. I would strongly recommend evaluating longer periods of time for the testing phase, because that's where you really get some great feedback and start to understand what policies users are tolerant of and which ones they're not. But obviously questions like that, there's so many specifics. We'd have to have a little bit more intel into the environment and the desired end state, device-wise, to give a good timeline for that.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you for that answer. Another question, does this apply to my server infrastructure? Are there things that Intune can do within my server environment?
I think technically the answer would be you could, but you shouldn't. So this is going to be endpoints, right? This is a unified endpoint management technology for endpoint devices, not server environments. I think technically you might be able to do some stuff there, but that's the type of thing that I would do in my nerd demo environment, and I don't think I would ever recommend that for production.
Okay, great. Thanks for your honesty there. One more question here, and again, guys, the chat window is open. If you do have a question, please post it, and we'll do our best to answer it. If not, follow up at a later date. Steve, this last question that I have is, what is the roadmap here? It looks like this product could eventually replace SCCM and Active Directory.
So it will not replace Active Directory because we still need that. It leverages Azure Active Directory for identity and information to authenticate users, etc. So that part, it will not go away. SCCM, there's been a little bit of confusion, and I think Microsoft, as part of their evolution in messaging on this, has gone from this will replace SCCM to it will not, but they work great together. So if you wanted to shift workloads from one to the other or back and forth, you can. Within SCCM today, there is a wizard that will allow you to attach it to Intune, and then you kind of get the best of both worlds. In the past, it sounded like they were steering customers towards Intune as the replacement. Now it sounds like they're steering customers to leveraging both as the destination itself.
Okay, fair enough. Well, to the audience, thank you for the questions. We'll give it another second here as we look to wind down the call. But essentially, Steve, again, lots of thank yous. Appreciate the content. It's been relevant for sure. And, Sam, I'm not sure if you guys want to talk about some of the other events that we have coming up at Katalyst. But again, please continue to check our website, and we will do our best to get relevant content out so you guys can learn and stay educated on some of these new features and functionalities that we see lots of customers deploying. But Steve, again, thank you again from both my perspective at Katalyst, and I'm sure many of our customers, for leading us today through this, what to expect on the Intune side of thing. Again, if you guys do have questions, as Steve alluded to earlier, you can ping your Katalyst rep, send a note in either to our email alias or just connect with us on LinkedIn or however you guys prefer, and we'll do our best to answer it. I appreciate everyone's time today. And again, check back soon. We will have some more content coming. We're, again, in addition to our threat hunting workshops that we're hosting, still trying to provide a monthly kind of overview for our clients on these new emerging technologies that are making a great impact on many of our customers. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for joining. We will send out the link to the recording so you can share it with anybody else in your organization that didn't have an opportunity to make it. We know lots of you guys have some craziness going on right now in dealing with you know, the criticality of the COVID-19 and the remote working challenges that your business is facing. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you guys on our next one. Thanks again, Steve, and great job.
Thanks, everybody.